South Africa, can you please join us? I think we are waiting for the connection with South Africa. Just a few more seconds, and we should have South Africa online now. While we are waiting for the connection with South Africa, we'll just show a short video again. It seems we still have a problem of connection with South Africa, so we are re-establishing the connection with South Africa. In the meantime, I welcome to speak next His Excellency President Xi Jinping, President of the People's Republic of China. Excellency, you have the floor.
President of the World Health Assembly, Director General of the World Health Organization, dear delegates. To begin with, I wish to say that it is of significant importance for this World Health Assembly to be held at such a critical moment as the human race battles its novel coronavirus. While we are facing the most serious global public health emergency since the end of the Second World War, catching the world by surprise, COVID-19 has hit over 210 countries and regions, affected more than 7 billion people around the world, and claimed over 300,000 precious lives. I mourn for every life lost and express condolence to the bereaved families.
向他们的家属表示慰问。人类文明史也是一部同疾病和灾难的斗争史。病毒没有国界，疫病不分种族。面对来势汹汹的新冠肺炎疫情，国际社会没有退缩，各国人民勇敢前行，守望相助，风雨同舟，展现了人间大爱，汇聚起同疫情斗争的磅礴之力。经过艰苦卓绝努力，付出巨大代价，中国有力扭转了疫情局势，维护了人民生命安全和身体健康。中方始终本着公开、透明、负责任的态度，及时向世卫组织及相关国家通报疫情信息。第一时间发布病毒基因序列等信息，毫无保留同各方分享防控和救治经验，尽己所能为有需要的国家提供了大量支持和帮助。主席先生，现在疫情还在蔓延，防控仍需努力。我愿提出以下建议。
To this end, I want to make the following proposals. First, we must do everything we can for COVID-19 control and treatment. This is the most urgent task. We must always put the people first, for nothing in the world is more precious than people's lives. We need to deploy medical expertise and critical supplies to places where they are needed the most. We need to take a strong step in such key areas as prevention, quarantine, detection, treatment, and tracing. We need to move as fast as we can to curb the global spread of the virus and do our best to stem cross-border transmission. We need to step up information sharing, exchange experience and best practice, and pursue international cooperation on testing methods, clinical treatment, and vaccine and medicine research and development. We also need to continue supporting global research by scientists on the source and transmission routes of the virus. Second, the World Health Organization should lead the global response. Under the leadership of Dr. Tedros, WHO has made a major contribution in leading and advancing the global response to COVID-19. His good work is applauded by the international community. At this critical juncture, to support WHO is to support international cooperation and the battle for saving lives as well.
支持挽救生命。
China calls on the international community to increase political and financial support for WHO so as to mobilize resources worldwide to defeat the virus. Third, we must provide greater support for Africa. Developing countries, African countries in particular, have weaker public health systems. Helping them build capacity must be our top priority in COVID-19 response. The world needs to provide more material, technological, and personal support for African countries. China has sent a tremendous amount of medical supplies and assistance to over 50 African countries and the African Union. 5 Chinese medical expert teams have also been sent to the African continent. In total, in the past 7 decades, over 200 million people in Africa have received care and treatment from Chinese medical teams. At present, 46 resident Chinese medical teams are in Africa, helping with COVID-19 containment efforts locally. Fourth, we must strengthen global governance in the area of public health. We human beings will eventually prevail over the coronavirus. Yet, this may not be the last time a major health emergency comes knocking at our door. In view of the weakness and deficiencies exposed by COVID-19, we need to improve the governance system for public health security. We need to respond more quickly to public health emergencies and establish global and regional reserve centers of anti-epidemic supplies. China supports the idea of a comprehensive review of the global response to COVID-19 after it is brought under control, to sum up experience and address deficiencies. This work should be based on science and professionalism, led by the WHO and conducted in objective and impartial manner. Fifth, we must restore economic and social development while working on an ongoing basis to contain the virus. Countries where conditions permit may reopen businesses and schools in an orderly fashion in observance of WHO's professional recommendations. In the meantime, international macroeconomic policy coordination should be stepped up, and global industrial and supply chains be kept stable and unclogged if we are to restore growth to the economy of the world. Sixth, we must strengthen international cooperation. Mankind is a community with a shared future. Solidarity and cooperation is our most powerful weapon for defeating the virus. This is the key lessons the world has learned from fighting HIV/AIDS, Ebola, avian influenza, H1N1, and other major epidemics. And solidarity and cooperation is a sure way through which we, the people of the world, can defeat this novel coronavirus. Mr. President, China stands for the vision of building a community with a shared future for mankind. China takes it as its responsibility to ensure not just the life and health of its own citizens, but also global public health. For the sake of boosting international cooperation against COVID-19, I would like to announce the following. China will provide $2 billion over 2 years to help with COVID-19 response, and with economic and social development in affected countries, especially developing countries. China will work with the UN to set up a global humanitarian response depot and hub in China, ensure the operation of anti-epidemic supply chains, and foster green corridors for fast-track transportation and customs clearance. China will establish a cooperation mechanism for its hospitals to pair up with 30 African hospitals and accelerate the building of the Africa CDC headquarters to help the continent ramp up its disease preparedness and control capacity.
中国新冠疫苗研发完成并投入使用后，将作为全球公共产品，为实现疫苗在发展中国家的可及性和可担负性做出中国贡献。中国将同20国集团成员一道，落实暂缓最贫困国家债务偿付倡议，并愿同国际社会一道，加大对疫情特别重、压力特别大的国家的支持力度，帮助其克服当前的困难。我呼吁，让我们携起手来，共同佑护各国人民生命和健康，共同佑护人类共同的地球家园，共同构建人类卫生健康共同体。谢谢大家。
Thank you, Excellency. J'ai le plaisir à présent de donner la parole au président de la France, Son Excellence le président Emmanuel Macron. Vous avez la parole.
Monsieur le Président de l'Assemblée mondiale de la santé, Monsieur le Secrétaire général des Nations unies, Mesdames et Messieurs les chefs d'État et de gouvernement, Monsieur le Directeur général de l'OMS, je veux vous remercier de m'avoir invité à ouvrir avec vous cette 73e Assemblée mondiale de la santé. Cette session est sans nul doute l'une des plus importantes de l'histoire de l'Organisation mondiale de la santé. Elle doit être un moment d'unité, de solidarité, mais aussi de lucidité et d'action face à la crise mondiale inédite que nous traversons tous. Souvenons-nous de ce qui a présidé à la fondation de l'OMS en 1948, bâtir un monde nouveau où chacun pourrait jouir d'une meilleure santé, parce que c'est le droit fondamental de tout être humain. Souvenons-nous des progrès aussi accomplis depuis, de tout ce que nous avons su faire ensemble avec l'OMS, avec tous les acteurs de la santé mondiale, au service de cet objectif. L'augmentation de l'espérance de vie, le recul de la mortalité infantile, l'éradication de maladies meurtrières comme la variole, le combat qui reste entier quant à lui contre la tuberculose, le paludisme, le VIH, pour l'élargissement de l'accès aux médicaments, à la vaccination, pour le renforcement des systèmes de santé. La pandémie de Covid-19 a bouleversé nos vies, nos sociétés, a mis nos économies à l'arrêt, a aussi révélé nos vulnérabilités à tous. Elle nous a rappelé aussi, s'il le fallait, toute la valeur de la santé humaine et de ceux qui en prennent. Je tiens, en cette année consacrée par l'OMS aux sages-femmes et aux infirmiers, à saluer tous ceux qui, chaque jour, sont sur le terrain pour prendre soin des autres, parfois au péril de leur vie, comme l'épouvantable attaque contre une maternité en Afghanistan l'a encore montré tragiquement. Alors, au moment où les soignants se battent contre la pandémie, au moment où les populations de tous nos pays font face avec courage, nous n'avons pas le droit de nous diviser. Nous n'avons pas le droit de nous dérober. Nous avons collectivement un devoir d'efficacité. La priorité absolue, la seule qui vaille, c'est de venir à bout de cette pandémie. Chacun de nous porte en lui une partie de la solution. États, organisations internationales, fonds spécialisés, organisations de la société civile, industries pharmaceutiques, banques de développement, citoyens. Ce n'est qu'en unissant nos forces que nous viendrons à bout de cette pandémie. Nous avons besoin de l'OMS pour son rôle irremplaçable de coordination, pour son expertise scientifique, sa connaissance du terrain. Nous avons besoin d'une OMS forte face au Covid-19. Et l'OMS, c'est nous. Ce sont ces États membres. Il dépend donc de nous de lui permettre de jouer tout son rôle dans la réponse internationale aux pandémies. C'est la raison pour laquelle la France a décidé il y a quelques jours de renforcer substantiellement le soutien financier apporté à notre organisation. C'est la raison pour laquelle, aux côtés de l'OMS, avec nos partenaires européens, avec l'ensemble des acteurs de la santé mondiale, nous avons lancé l'initiative ACT-A pour soutenir massivement la recherche, accélérer le développement et permettre un accès universel aux moyens de lutte contre la pandémie. Parce que oui, un vaccin, s'il est découvert face au Covid-19, sera un bien public mondial auquel chacun devra pouvoir avoir accès. C'est une question d'efficacité. Tant que la maladie sera la réalité de quelques-uns, elle sera une menace pour tous. C'est une question de principe. La santé humaine ne se discute pas, ne se réserve pas, ne se monnaie. L'Europe s'engage pleinement dans la construction de la réponse internationale à la pandémie. Le 4 mai dernier, la conférence de financement organisée par la Commission européenne a permis de mobiliser 7,5 milliards d'euros au service des objectifs. Avec ses partenaires internationaux, l'Europe porte dans cette session une réponse solide pour renforcer l'application du règlement sanitaire international, améliorer les systèmes d'alerte et de réaction aux urgences, renforcer la recherche, mieux comprendre en toute transparence et avec un esprit de coopération la crise à laquelle nous sommes confrontés et en tirer tous les enseignements et donc mieux y répondre. Nous devons regarder en face avec lucidité, avec exigence, ce qui a fonctionné et ce qui n'a pas fonctionné dans la gestion internationale de la crise. Nous avons l'occasion d'apporter une réponse unie à la pandémie, sans complaisance, sans accusation non fondée.
Single, united response to the pandemic, free of complacency and unfounded accusations. We need to be united,
J'appelle l'ensemble des membres de cette Assemblée à la responsabilité et à l'action. Au nom de ce qui a présidé à la fondation de notre organisation et au nom d'un droit fondamental de l'humanité.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président. It's my pleasure to now invite the President of the Republic of Korea, His Excellency President Moon Jae-in. You have the floor, Excellency.
존경하는 의장님, 사무총장님, 각국 대표단 여러분.
Delegates from various nations, I find it greatly meaningful to speak before the World Health Assembly, a gathering convened to overcome COVID-19 and usher in new hope. First of all, I would like to offer my deepest condolences and words of comfort to the victims of COVID-19 all over the world. Moreover, my utmost respect and gratitude go to the medical and quarantine professionals in each country, putting themselves at risk to protect the health and safety of humanity. Today, I would like to introduce to you the choice made by the Korean people to overcome COVID-19, the choice of a freedom for all. The Republic of Korea was one of the first countries hit by COVID-19, and we had to swiftly identify a solution against the aggressive virus. In that moment of crisis and challenge, the Korean people made a bold decision. We took our own individual freedoms and turned it to an even greater freedom for all. Rather than regarding our neighbors as dangerous spreaders of the virus or enforcing nationwide lockdown measures, we chose to protect their safety for the sake of our own safety. In order to uphold free movement and keep the economy going, the Korean people chose to wear masks and participate actively in social distancing. Even in the face of this social distancing, however, we grew closer and our hearts fonder. Healthcare workers gave their all through volunteer service, while citizens encouraged them through various acts of sharing. In the recent nationwide general elections, despite the rigorous quarantine procedures in place, over 29 million Korean voters went to the ballots. As a result, we had a true celebration of democracy, all without a single new infection, with an even higher voter turnout than usual. This idea of protecting our neighbors developed further to include the neighbors beyond our borders. We kept our borders open and maintained our ties of exchange, while also providing diagnostic kits, face masks, and other supplies as much as we could. The Korean people displayed the highest form of civic virtues to practice the spirit of freedom for all and voluntarily participated in quarantine efforts. This was what really enabled the three main principles of openness, transparency, and democracy to flourish. The government also supported the people's efforts with swift, widespread testing and creative approaches. The Republic of Korea, however, has not yet achieved complete victory over this virus. We have transitioned from social distancing to routine distancing and are working to balance our daily lives with ongoing quarantine efforts, and yet we are still seeing instances of sporadic cluster infections. Moreover, the ongoing global pandemic still poses grave threats. If we do not come up with a viable treatment option or a vaccine, a new wave of infections could break out once again. However, one thing is absolutely clear. Sharing information and cooperating with one another demonstrate a power that no virus will ever have, a power that only humans possess. COVID-19 is threatening our freedoms, a universal virtue of all humankind, but it is solidarity and cooperation based on such freedoms that will prove to be the strongest weapon we have to triumph over COVID-19. Honorable Chair, distinguished delegates, based on the spirit of a greater freedom for all, I would like to make three proposals for overcoming the current crisis and preparing for its aftermath. First, we must expand our humanitarian assistance for countries with vulnerable healthcare systems and share our quarantine experiences. Until the day everyone is free from COVID-19, we must work together and leave no one behind. This year, the Republic of Korea is planning to provide humanitarian assistance worth $100 million. Our response to the crisis, our immigration policies, and other such experiences and data we have accumulated during this outbreak will be continued to share with the international community. To safeguard the health of all humanity, we will continue to work closely with the WHO. Second, in order to develop vaccines and treatments, we must cooperate beyond our borders. Furthermore, such vaccines and treatments are public goods that must be distributed equitably to the whole world. The Republic of Korea fully supports the efforts of the WHO to develop vaccines and treatments. The Republic of Korea is also working with Gavi, the Global Fund, UNITAID, and the International Vaccine Institute as a donor country. And this year, we will begin contributing to CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. Third, we must update the WHO international health regulations and other relevant norms and augment them with binding legal force. A novel infectious disease could emerge at any time, and we must be able to respond more quickly and effectively. Infection-related data should be shared among countries in a more transparent manner, and an early warning system and a cooperation mechanism must be jointly established. At the G20 and ASEAN Plus 3 summits, various measures for cooperation were proposed, and I hope they will be made more concrete. Honorable Chair, Director General, delegates from various nations. In the face of crisis, humankind must choose solidarity and cooperation over the pursuit of individual interests. The world must unite under the banner of mutual trust and inclusiveness in the face of deepening crisis. If the international community firmly commits to the greater cause of freedom for all, we will undoubtedly overcome the current crisis quickly and bolster our hope for the post-COVID-19 era.
Thank you very much, Excellency. We are now trying to reconnect with South Africa to listen to President Ramaphosa's speech. If you are online, can you please click on the video? I think we still have connection problems, so I will ask our next guest. Our next guest speaker is no stranger to the Health Assembly. Please join me to welcome the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, Angela Merkel. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Sehr geehrter Herr Generaldirektor Tedros, Exzellenzen, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, wir erleben eine globale Krise. Fast 5 Millionen Menschen weltweit, die sich Stand heute mit dem Coronavirus infiziert haben und ebenfalls Stand heute rund 300.000 Todesfälle weltweit, außerdem geschlossene Grenzen und herbe Einschnitte im Wirtschafts- und Alltagsleben zeigen, dass kaum ein Land von der Pandemie und ihren Folgen verschont bleibt. Diese Krise kann kein Land allein lösen. Wir müssen gemeinsam handeln. Daher danke ich Ihnen allen, die Sie an der Weltgesundheitsversammlung teilnehmen, um gemeinsam nach Lösungen zu suchen. Dabei kann uns helfen, dass die Ebola-Epidemie in Westafrika im Jahre 2014 zu notwendigen Reformen der Weltgesundheitsorganisation geführt hat. Auch die G7 und die G20-Staaten haben das Thema Gesundheit zu einer Priorität gemacht. Und auf der UN-Generalversammlung im letzten Jahr haben wir den globalen Aktionsplan für ein gesundes Leben und das Wohlergehen aller Menschen verabschiedet. Gleichwohl zeigt die Coronavirus-Pandemie noch einmal besonders nachdrücklich, dass wir weltweit noch mehr tun müssen. Für bessere Frühwarnmechanismen und Präventionsmaßnahmen, für mehr Forschungskooperation, für stärkere Gesundheitssysteme. Die Weltgesundheitsorganisation ist die legitimierte globale Institution, bei der die Fäden zusammenlaufen. Weil das so ist, müssen wir immer wieder prüfen, wie wir die Abläufe in der WHO weiter verbessern können. Dazu gehört auch, für ein nachhaltiges Finanzierungssystem zu sorgen. Am dringendsten aber ist jetzt natürlich die Coronavirus-Pandemie einzudämmen. Hierfür bedarf es weltweit geeigneter Diagnostika und Therapeutika. Außerdem gilt es, einen Impfstoff zu entwickeln, der natürlich für alle zugänglich und bezahlbar sein muss. Nicht zuletzt müssen wir die vielfältigen wirtschaftlichen und sozialen Folgen der Pandemie gemeinsam abfedern. Wie wir mit der Herausforderung umgehen, wird unsere nationalen Gesellschaften wie auch die internationale Gemeinschaft prägen. Ich bin überzeugt, dass wir die Coronavirus-Pandemie überwinden werden. Je mehr wir global gemeinsam daran arbeiten, umso schneller und besser wird uns das gelingen. Ich ermuntere alle, sich daran zu beteiligen, und ich danke allen, die zum globalen Gemeinwohl beitragen.
More rapidly. So I'd like to thank all those who contribute
Thank you very much, Madam Chancellor.
Well-being. Thank you.
I have the pleasure to welcome the Prime Minister of Barbados, Her Excellency Mayor Amo Motley. You have the floor, Excellency.
Good afternoon, Mr. President and distinguished delegates. Today I join with the defenders of democracy across the Caribbean Community region, the wider Americas, and indeed the small island developing states of the world, who recognize the importance of fearless, robust leadership. I speak to you from this region of the Caribbean, CARICOM as we're known, a region that is characterized by developing health systems that suffer from the same vulnerabilities as many of our countries. Low numbers of ICU beds per capita, few intensivist doctors and critical care nurses, few ventilators per capita. And regrettably, our people have a higher rate of NCDs and obesity than we would like. We have watched how COVID has decimated rich and powerful nations with strong curative care systems, killing their people, overrunning their healthcare systems, and halting business. And so early on, CARICOM decided that we cannot fight the illness and that we had to delay the arrival of COVID-19 into the region as far as possible. We mobilized all of our regional agencies, those that dealt with public health, like the Caribbean Public Health Agency, CARFA, or the modeling, like the University of the West Indies, or with our disaster preparedness and mitigation, like SEDIMA, or with the tracking and the movement of persons through our borders, like the Joint Regional Communications Center of CARICOM. The Caribbean region's economies ranks among the most travel and tourism dependent economies in the world. And this has exposed our people and our economies in a way that we have not experienced since becoming independent nations more than 50 years ago in some instances. In our own case in Barbados, our Emergency Operations Center in the Ministry of Health has been functioning since mid-January. We organized our health systems to improve access to the health service for COVID-19 patients, while at the same time reducing the risk of exposure for the most vulnerable populations through reduced movement from as early as February of this year. We repurposed an abandoned naval base into a facility for COVID patients. This expanded our access to critical care beds by over 300%. Fortunately, our investment in and our preparedness of our public health officials over the decades has permitted us to do the type of public health surveillance to detect cases, trace and quarantine contacts, isolate and treat the ill. You will forgive me if I use this opportunity to salute the public health pioneers of the Caribbean over the last 7 decades. They have been true heroes to our people. Our CARICOM heads of government adopted a whole of government and a whole of society approach. In addition, we reached to our Caribbean neighbor Cuba and received hundreds of doctors and nurses to help us. I take this opportunity to thank our brothers and sisters in Cuba and the government of the Republic of Cuba in particular for its unswerving assistance during this pandemic. It has been palpable and clear to all of our population. So, our CARICOM family banded together to lock down and ride out this first wave. And it has been a long and treacherous wave. The closing of our borders and the trebling of unemployment and the reduction of our government revenues by half have created grave challenges for many of us. Similarly, the psyche of people in our hemisphere has been disturbed. For the majority of persons under the age of 70 in the Caribbean, many of whom have never had to confront grave challenges, the world appears to be on autopilot. They wonder who is in control and where is the leadership? Where is the global cooperation that they so expected? And for too many of our citizens globally, life has become a game of roulette, betting on numbers and colors and ignoring the science that needs to underpin our actions. Nations rich and poor are seeking inspiration. This is a crisis, therefore, that strikes not only at the heart of our humanity, but also at the organization of our human societies. It is a crisis that calls for global leadership that will allow us to rebuild our humanity, our environment, and the equity so badly needed in our societies and our economies. COVID has brought many of us closer than we have ever been with each other. It has equally cast a brighter light on the inequities in our society, but then it has also allowed the earth to breathe yet again. It is why we have contended that nothing short of coordinated global leadership, not just of governments, but also from people of influence, whether from the religious or faith-based organizations or in other areas of the society, that they ought to be involved. We need a global leadership initiative that is rooted in moral leadership, more so than ever. Moral leadership that recognizes that 75 years after the United Nations was formed, it is not good enough for us to accept that people or countries can fall through the cracks. That in particular, as we reflect on the events of the last 3 months, were it not for the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, or CARPHA, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, and more recently the WHO, we would believe that we were living in the wild, wild west that we see in movies, where only those who are strong and well endowed should survive. It is the intervening hand of these agencies that I just mentioned that has sought to move us as a region closer to a level playing field. But my friends, there is still much work to be done. Moral leadership that will finally recognize that the use of historic per capita income to determine access to concessional funds or grant funds, or indeed, as I mentioned earlier, to determine fair access to the procurement of goods is unacceptable. As I have said many times, it is the equivalent of taking my blood pressure reading from 2 years ago and using it today to determine my vulnerability to a stroke. A completely useless exercise. Even when our circumstances deteriorate, there has been no review that takes into account the inherent vulnerability to which we are exposed and which prevents us from being able to access critical money or goods. In addition, the use of certain proxy criteria to access technologies, medicines, vaccines, or concessional funds would exclude vulnerable countries such as ours in the Caribbean, some in Latin America, and even in the Pacific. Why? Because we are using criteria that are more relevant to fighting problems that have little or no relevance to our current vulnerabilities and challenges. For example, we are less than 2 weeks away from the beginning of the hurricane season. Tropical Storm Arthur has already formed off of the Bahamas, well in advance of that start. Many of us are already confronting droughts and the presence of sargassum weed as a result of the climate crisis, and it is wreaking havoc in our societies. But none of these challenges are captured by per capita income or by maternal mortality rates. None of them. In addition, where there is global market failure, as is happening now, small middle-income states are at risk of not being seen or heard, or not even accessing critical goods and supplies. I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Tedros for reaching out to the Executive Director of the Global Fund last evening to advocate for the countries in the region that have been excluded from procurement through the consortium of critical COVID-19 medical supplies. We need to be included. It is also therefore clear that we need therefore additional criteria to determine equitable access and fair allocation, criteria that better take into account that vulnerability which we have. And if we're asking for the same solution for climate, for external shocks, as we are asking for the pandemic, it is because all three destroy our capacity to produce as nations and the ability of our people to survive. It is against this background, my friends, that equitable access and fair allocation of resources will allow our small states, particularly middle-income ones, dependent on travel, to be able to have access to increased supplies for testing, such that we can reopen our societies safely to intra-regional travel and thereafter to extra-regional travel. But it will also better allow us to ensure that there is a return to safe work by safe people, the least vulnerable people to COVID-19 in our countries. While we can tolerate high unemployment and severe contraction of our economies for 2 to 3 months, the consequences to our societies of prolonged shutdown are as equal as the high incidence of COVID among our population. That is why we need urgently to get access to adequate numbers of the appropriate tests, in particular the rapid tests that are affordable and reliable if we are to allow our economies and societies to reopen safely. Our small states have been suffering from high debt and low growth for decades, and we believe that there should also be more mature and relevant conversations for middle-income, small island developing states across the globe, especially as it relates to our debt obligations in the midst of this pandemic. Many countries will either have an orderly restructuring of debt, or at the very least, a debt moratorium that provides certainty for both the borrower and the lender. Or they will have a disorderly unraveling that will create a crisis both within the respective countries and within the global financial markets. These conversations must admit of greater certainty in the management of our affairs, and I pray that the global community will have the courage to allow us to have them. I say so, conscious that Barbados took a major leap of faith when we restructured our debt in the last 18 months to include natural disaster clauses in our domestic and external debt instruments that provide for greater fiscal space to be created through a moratorium on the payment of principal and a capitalization of the interests should we face a natural disaster event. The certainty that these natural disaster clauses provide is increased fiscal space. Were this provision available in the context of this pandemic, it would bring tremendous relief to those countries and better position many of us to rebuild in a post-COVID-19 environment. Let me at this juncture express my appreciation to Director General Dr. Tedros and the WHO for the recent appointments of Sir Andrew Whitty and Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, a dear friend of the Caribbean, as special envoys for the North and South respectively for the WHO's Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. It is intended that they will ensure that there's a framework for equitable access to tests, therapeutics, and a vaccine, if ever there is one. In addition, our Caribbean countries salute your inclusive leadership and recognize that without your timely intervention, the efforts of PAHO and CARFA would be stymied as we try to meet the needs of our populations. 42 years on, our community still believes that the principles of Alma Ata must mean something, that we should have equitable access to the supplies we need, that we should be able to afford to save the lives of our citizens, and that the solutions should be appropriate to our context. I must add at this point that global moral leadership also means that in aid of supporting human lives, which none of us can replace, that there ought to be a suspension of international sanctions imposed against countries. Whatever differences or difficulties we may have with each other, they can be put on pause while we wrestle to the ground this awful pandemic. For wherever it exists, it affects each and every one of us. My friends, there was life before COVID-19, and I know that there will be life after COVID-19. For this reason, even with the pandemic, we must not drop the ball on those other global health priorities that are critical to our overall development. I refer specifically to the chronic NCDs, the silent killers of diabetes and cardiovascular disease, hypertension. I refer to HIV and AIDS, and to the antimicrobial resistance that we are fighting, and the other health-related diseases that come as a result of the climate crisis. For our populations, these challenges remain real and continue to be a silent but real and present danger. Let us use the cooperation we are trying to build to also help fight these challenges. Why? Because solidarity, unity, and partnership remain enduring principles for us. These are the principles that led our Caribbean countries to embrace the pursuit of democracy in the late 1930s, just as they also were the principles that helped the world rebuild after 3 decades of challenges 75 years ago with the formation of the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions. I pray that we will have the fortitude to fight against these challenges of our times, relying on these same principles of solidarity, unity, and partnership. I wish the leadership and management of the World Health Organization success in its efforts to promote health, to keep the world safe, and to serve the vulnerable people of our world as it is required to do. Your mission 73 years on, after your formation, remains critical. I say to you, as I leave, the world watches on with bated breath. We wish you all of the very best as you deliberate over these 2 days, for so much depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. We come back now to South Africa, and I invite the President of South Africa, current Chairperson of the African Union, His Excellency President Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa, to make his statement.
Thank you. I would like to welcome this opportunity to address the World Health Assembly. We are in the midst of the most serious public health emergency our world has experienced in over 100 years. containing the coronavirus pandemic has dwarfed all other issues facing the international community and individual countries. The pandemic has profound social, political, economic, and security implications for all of us. It is impacting on human health, the economies of all affected countries, and the livelihoods of millions of people. Although the virus has affected both developed and developing countries, it is the poor who suffer the most. The pandemic has highlighted the dangerous and growing inequality that exists between countries and within them. The healthcare systems of many countries are struggling to cope. Some have been weakened by underfunding and neglect. Others are under pressure because they were designed to serve the select few. The pandemic has devastated the livelihoods of millions of people in many countries. The global recovery depends on our ability to accept the reality that this virus will be with us for some time and that we need to prepare to adapt accordingly. The social distancing, hygiene, and other protocols recommended by the World Health Organization must become part of our everyday lives. Africa affirms its full support for the World Health Organization, which has been key in guiding the international response to the pandemic. The World Health Organization has been instrumental in providing guidance and support to African governments. Africa is extremely vulnerable to the ravages of this virus and needs every possible support and assistance. The African Union has taken very deliberate steps to respond to the scourge. The African Union has made a call for developing countries to be assisted in their efforts to combat the pandemic and to rebuild their economies. This assistance needs to include debt relief. It also needs to include assistance with regard to diagnostic and therapeutic medical supplies. To turn back the frontiers of the pandemic, we must also deepen international collaboration as well as solidarity around issues like research and development and investment. We fully support the initiative by the World Health Organization, together with many other governments, in assisting the developing countries. For its part, South Africa is participating in several research initiatives. We must ensure that there is equitable access to medical equipment, technologies, in all respects. In this final decade towards the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, we must press ahead with our goal of making universal health care a reality for all the people of the world, and no one must be left behind. The virus has demonstrated the essential value of universal health coverage, and this is where we need full solidarity. Let us continue to be bold and courageous in confronting this pandemic. Let us continue to collaborate and act in solidarity in the interests of the millions of people around the world. I thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. It is my honor to now give the floor to the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Bokoz. President Somaruga, President Ramaphosa, President Xi, President Macron, President Moon, Chancellor Merkel, Prime Minister Motley, Mr. Secretary General, President of the World Health Assembly, Excellencies, colleagues, and friends. I would like to start by thanking all of our distinguished guests for their support today. Thank you for taking the time to address this important assembly. Thank you for your efforts to respond to COVID-19 at home and abroad. And thank you for your strong support for WHO at this critical time. My sisters and brothers, as you know, this year is the International Year of the Nurse and the Midwife. This assembly was intended to be a moment of recognition for the incredible contribution that nurses and midwives make every day in every country. The pandemic has robbed us of that opportunity, but it has only served to illustrate why nurses, midwives, and all health workers are so important. Nurses and midwives have been on the front lines of the fight against COVID-19, putting themselves in harm's way. Many have made the ultimate sacrifice in service of humanity. Last month, WHO published the first State of the World's Nursing Report. It shows that the world is facing a shortfall of 6 million nurses to achieve and sustain universal health coverage. But it also provides a roadmap for governments to invest in nursing, to fill that gap and progress towards universal health coverage, health for all. Now, more than ever, the world needs nurses and midwives. Please join me, wherever you are, in standing to show your appreciation for these true health heroes. Thank you. Thank you. We have come together as the nations of the world to confront the defining health crisis of our time. We come in grief for those we have lost. We come with concern for those still fighting for their lives. We come with determination to triumph over this common threat. And we come with hope for the future. The world has confronted several pandemics before. This is the first caused by a coronavirus. This is a dangerous enemy with a dangerous combination of features. This virus is efficient, fast, and fatal. It can operate in the dark, spread silently if we are not paying attention, then suddenly explodes if we are not ready, and moves like a bushfire. We have seen the same pattern repeated in cities and countries the world over. We must treat this virus with the respect and attention it deserves. More than 4.5 million cases of COVID-19 have now been reported to WHO, and more than 300,000 people have lost their lives. But numbers don't even begin to tell the story of this pandemic. Each loss of life leaves a scar for families, communities, and nations. The health impacts of the pandemic extend far beyond sickness and death caused by the virus itself. The disruption to health systems threatens to unwind decades of progress against maternal and child mortality, HIV, malaria, tuberculosis, non-communicable diseases, mental health, polio, and many other of the most urgent health threats. And yet, this is so much more than a health crisis. Lives and livelihoods have been lost or upended. Hundreds of millions of people have lost their jobs. Fear and uncertainty abound. The global economy is headed for its sharpest contraction since the Great Depression. The pandemic has brought out the best and worst of humanity, fortitude and fear, solidarity and suspicion, rapport and recrimination. This contagion exposes the fault lines, inequalities, injustices, and contradictions of our modern world. It has highlighted our strengths and our vulnerabilities. Science has been hailed and scorned. Nations have come together as never before, and geopolitical divisions have been thrown into sharp relief. We have seen what's possible with cooperation and what risk without it. The pandemic is a reminder of the intimate and delicate relationship between people and planet. Any efforts to make our world safer are doomed to fail unless they address the critical interface between people and pathogens and the existential threat of climate change that's making our Earth less habitable. For all the economic, military, and technological might of nations, we have been humbled by this very small microbe. If this virus is teaching us anything, it's humility. Time for humility. 6 months ago, it would have been inconceivable to most that the world's biggest cities would fall early quiet, that shops, restaurants, schools, and workplaces would be closed, that global travel would grind to a standstill, that simply shaking hands could be life-threatening. Terms once used only by epidemiologists like reproduction number, physical distancing, and contact tracing have become common parlance. In less than 5 months, the pandemic has encircled the globe. All countries have faced challenges in coming to grips with this virus, rich and poor, large and small. Low-income countries, small island developing states, and those suffering from violence and conflict are trying to confront this threat in the most challenging of circumstances. How do you practice physical distancing when you live in crowded conditions? How do you stay at home when you have to work to feed your family? How do you practice hand hygiene when you lack clean water? Some countries are succeeding in preventing widespread community transmission. Some have issued stay-at-home orders and imposed severe social restrictions to suppress community transmission. Some are still bracing for the worst, and some are now assessing how to ease the restrictions that have exacted such a heavy social and economic toll. WHO fully understands and supports the desire of countries to get back on their feet and back to work. It's precisely because we want the fastest possible global recovery that we urge countries to proceed with caution. Countries that move too fast without putting in place the public health architecture to detect and suppress transmission run a real risk of handicapping their own recovery. Early serology studies are painting a consistent picture. Even in the worst affected regions, the proportion of the population with the telltale antibodies is no more than 20%, and in most places, less than 10%. In other words, the majority of the world's population remains susceptible to this virus. The risk remains high, and we have a long road to travel. Over the past few months, we have learned an enormous amount about how to prevent infections and save lives. But there is no single action that has made the difference. No testing alone, no contact tracing alone, not isolation, quarantine, hand hygiene, or physical distancing alone. The countries that have done well have done it all. This is the comprehensive approach that WHO has called for consistently. There is no silver bullet. There is no simple solution. There is no panacea. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. It takes hard work, fidelity to science, learning, adapting as you go, and difficult decisions, of course. But there are many common components that must be part of every national strategy. A whole of government and a whole of society response that engages and empowers people and communities to keep themselves and others safe. The commitment and capacity to find, isolate, test, and care for every case and trace and quarantine every contact, and special attention to vulnerable groups like people living in nursing homes, refugee camps, prisons, and detention centers. Since day one, WHO has stood shoulder to shoulder with countries in this darkest of hours. WHO sounded the alarm early, and we sounded it often. We notified countries, issued guidance for health workers within 10 days, and declared global health emergency, our highest level of alert, on the 30th of January. At the time, there were less than 100 cases and no deaths outside China. We have provided technical guidance and strategic advice based on the latest science and experience. We have supported countries to adapt and implement that guidance. We have shipped diagnostics, personal protective equipment, oxygen, and other medical supplies to more than 120 countries. We have trained more than 2.6 million health workers in 23 languages. We have driven research and development through the Solidarity Trial. We have called the equitable access to vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics through the ACT, the ACT Accelerator. We have informed, engaged, and empowered people. We have fought the infodemic, combating myths with reliable information. And we have called consistently for the two essential ingredients for conquering this virus: national unity and global solidarity. We all have lessons to learn from the pandemic. Every country and every organization must examine its response and learn from its experience. WHO is committed to transparency, accountability, and continuous improvement. For us, change is a constant. In fact, The existing independent accountability mechanisms are already in operation since the pandemic started. The Independent Oversight Advisory Committee has today published its first report on the pandemic, with several recommendations for both the Secretariat and Member States. In that spirit, we welcome the proposed resolution before this Assembly, which calls for a stepwise process of impartial, independent, and comprehensive evaluation. To be truly comprehensive, such an evaluation must encompass the entirety of the response by all actors in good faith. So, I will initiate an independent evaluation at the earliest appropriate moment to review experience gained and lessons learned, and to make recommendations to improve national and global pandemic preparedness and response. But one thing is abundantly clear: the world must never be the same. We do not need a review to tell us that we must all do everything in our power to ensure this never happens again. Whatever lessons there are to learn from this pandemic, the greatest failing would be to not learn from them and to leave the world in the same vulnerable state it was before. If there is anything positive to come from this pandemic, it must be a safer and more resilient world. This is not a new message. Reviews after SARS, the H1N1 pandemic, and the West African Ebola epidemic highlighted shortcomings in global health security and made numerous recommendations for countries to address those gaps. Some were implemented, others went unheeded. The SARS outbreak gave rise to the revision of the international health regulations in 2005. The H1N1 pandemic saw the creation of the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, and the Ebola outbreak of 2014 and 15 led to the establishment of the Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility, the WHO Emergencies Program, and the Independent Oversight Advisory Committee. The world doesn't need another plan, another system, another mechanism, another committee, or another organization. It needs to strengthen, implement, and finance the systems and organizations it has, including WHO. Many leaders who have spoken today raised two issues: implementing, supporting WHO, and financing. The world can no longer afford the short-term amnesia that has characterized its response to health security for too long. The time has come to weave together the disparate strands of global health security into an unbreakable chain, a comprehensive framework for epidemic and pandemic preparedness. The world does not lack the tools, the science, or the resources to make it safer from pandemics. What it has lacked is the sustained commitment to use the tools, the science, and the resources it has. That must change, and it must change today. Today, I'm calling on all nations to resolve that they will do everything it takes to ensure that the 2020 coronavirus pandemic is never repeated. I'm calling on all nations to invest in strengthening and implementing the many tools at our disposal, especially the global treaty that underpins global health security, the international health regulations. To be successful, we must all commit to mutual ownership and accountability. One way to do that, proposed by the Africa Group last year, is through a system of universal periodic review, in which countries agree to a regular and transparent review of each nation's preparedness. Since my election at this assembly 3 years ago, I have made a priority of transforming WHO into an organization that's agile and responsive, focused on outcomes and impact. 2 years ago, I presented, and this assembly approved, the cornerstone of our transformation, WHO's 13th General Program of Work. At its heart are the ambitious triple billion targets: 1 billion more people enjoying better health and well-being, 1 billion more people benefiting from universal health coverage, and 1 billion more people better protected from health emergencies. These are the targets that the world has set itself to achieve by 2023 to get on track and stay on track for the Sustainable Development Goals. The WHO results report launched today provides a comprehensive picture of what WHO, its member states and partners have achieved in the past 2 years. On healthy populations, we have made important progress to improve the air people breathe, the food they eat, the water they drink, the roads they use, and the conditions in which they live and work are the most important actually in bringing health. On universal health coverage, the world came together last year to endorse the political declaration on UHC, an unprecedented commitment to the ideals of health for all. We have expanded access to prevention, testing, and treatment for HIV, TB, malaria, hepatitis C, hypertension, diabetes, cancer, and more. And to keep the world safe, WHO has investigated, when necessary, responded to more than 900 events in 141 countries. That includes coordinating a huge and complex response to the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, complicated by violence, a mobile population, and a weak health system. All of these efforts have been supported by an increased focus on science, evidence, and data. In the coming year, we will launch the WHO Academy to provide training for millions more health workers around the world. And the WHO Foundation will be launched in the next few weeks to broaden WHO's donor base. I am proud of the progress WHO has made in this and many other areas. However, much work remains to be done. Even before COVID-19, the world was off track for the SDGs. The pandemic threatens to set us back even further. It exploits and exacerbates existing gaps in gender equality, poverty, hunger, and more. Already we have seen the impact of the pandemic on immunization campaigns and many other essential health services. But the challenges we face cannot be an excuse to abandon